Hello, welcome to another in the Why Study series, and today I have with me Dr Mary Cunningham, who is going to talk about why study the Churches of the East. Mary, you're welcome.
Thank you.
The Churches of the East. Tell me what we're talking about before you tell me why we should study them.
Well, there are a large number of churches of the East, as we call them, which many people are not aware of, but they have been in the lands of the Near East for centuries, since the beginning of Christianity, and still are there, many in countries that are mainly under Islamic rule, but there are sizable minority populations of Christians in, for example, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and parts of North Africa, also Armenia. And these churches have been there from the very beginning. They are part of the apostolic outreach of the early church.
Now, one of the things that many Western Christians are familiar with is they're familiar with a map of the Mediterranean world, and with lines going from Palestine to North Africa and up to Greece and up to Italy. And of course, in a sense, that Mediterranean world, that's our background world, it's the world of the classics. But one of the things you say when you talk about the Church of the East is these are all churches that really were already outside the Roman Empire, and they were outside the area in the Eastern Roman Empire that spoke Greek.
Yes, that's true to some extent, except that before the 7th century, many of these areas were in the Roman dominion. Some of them, of course, were under Persian rule in that period. But until the Islamic conquest of the 7th century, for example, Syria, Palestine, Egypt, were part of the Roman Empire. The official language was Greek in these areas, also Latin for administrative purposes in some places. But there were always minority, or in fact majority populations speaking the local languages. Syriac, for example, is a descendant of the Aramaic that Jesus himself spoke with his disciples. And this language was spoken in the Near East by Christians among themselves, and was also used in their liturgy, although if they had an education, they might also have learned Greek and written in Greek. So some of these areas were in fact bilingual in the early Christian period.
And of course we have the very interesting example of there's theology from that area written in Greek, but also a vast amount written in Syriac.
Yes, and a lot of translation was going on from Greek into Syriac and vice versa, so that texts that would be written in one language would be disseminated quite quickly into other languages. And I should also mention the church in Egypt, which had the language of Coptic, which is a very ancient language, probably the language of the pharaohs, which Christians used in that area and still use today in their liturgies.
And of course, Coptic has come into our consciousness in the last 50 years because it was a monastery of Coptic monks that led to the discovery of all the texts from Nag Hammadi.
Yes, that's true.
And then further up the Nile, we have other churches. We've the churches of Ethiopia.
Yes, Ethiopia is a very ancient church as well. I think Ethiopia was evangelized in about the 4th century, if I remember correctly. But it is an Orthodox church. They use another language called Ge'ez and have their own traditions. And with all these languages and traditions in the Eastern churches, we get an amazing richness of musical traditions, texts, which have their own flavor and character in each of these traditions, and also artistic methods and styles which vary in the different areas. So it gives Christianity as a whole an enormous diversity, which I think many people are not aware of in the modern world.
Oh, I think most Western Christians, we think of all the variants which are really just subvariants of Latin, whether they're Catholic, Protestant, whatever. And then we might know there's something about the Greeks, and we might know about the Russians. But we've got the Armenians, Georgians. There's several different groups in Syria.
Yes.
Then Copts, Ethiopians, and of course there's very ancient churches even in India.
Yes, that's true. Yes.
What else do we learn from their study?
Well, as I said before, I think they have their own traditions, and one of the most exciting things about studying the Syrian tradition, for example, is that they produced a wealth of wonderful liturgical poetry and homiletic material, especially in between about the 4th and 6th centuries, before the Islamic period, which have a particular style and a richness of theology and imagery. Poets like Saint Ephrem the Syrian, who lived in the 4th century, produced liturgical poetry which explores typology of the Old Testament, typology being signs of Christ that we see in the texts of the Old Testament, and poetic imagery for Christ and for the Virgin Mary, which is just very unique and very worth studying in its own right. It also influenced Greek liturgical poetry in that period, and I think probably caused Greek liturgical hymnography and sermons to develop as they did from about the 5th century onward.
So even though these churches are further east than the Greek East, there was actually far more interchange with Greece.
Yes, with the Byzantine Church in particular, and the Greek-speaking Christians of that period.
And of course there's another aspect of this, in that many texts that have disappeared in Greek and Latin have survived in Coptic, or have survived in Armenian or Georgian. So, for instance, a text that I have worked on is the Didache, which only survives in one manuscript in Greek, but we've actually got fragments of it in Georgian and fragments of it in Coptic. And knowing that it's in these other languages is a way of finding out just how important that text was, but also seeing how there was a unity between these churches because they were translating and using one another's materials.
That's right, yes.
This is a very unfair question, but has the diversity of all these churches anything to say to Christianity today?
I'm not quite sure what you mean by diversity.
Well, what I mean is that there are different liturgies, different languages, different traditions of prayer, spirituality, and even, for instance, if you go to Jerusalem, you can see even their clergy all dressed differently. I think one of the problems in the West is we tend to think of diversity equals fragmentation. But you wonder, diversity is also richness.
Yes, it's richness. I think there's also a question whether these differences are superficial or fundamental. And some of them, you say the liturgies are different, but there is a basis, a core of those liturgies, which is very ancient, and so they are very close, in fact, although they may be different forms of early liturgies. And the essential difference really between the churches and what creates a schism between what we call the Oriental churches and, for example, the Chalcedonian Orthodox churches, the essential thing that divided them were doctrinal differences. Now, many would say today that these doctrinal differences are very slight, but at the time that the splits occurred in the 5th century, they were seen as very important and fundamental to the extent that these two churches or more churches could not receive communion together. And in fact, it's tragic because if you don't emphasize the differences, you see that it's a matter of emphasis more than of real complete doctrinal.
And of course, in recent years, there's been many different ways of trying to overcome those differences and churches entering back into communion with one another.
Yes, and there's very good understanding today between all the Orthodox churches, I would say. Fellowship, friendship, and a desire to be reunited, and much dialogue between them. It all hinges, the main differences hinge on how we understand the two natures in Christ, the divine and the humanity, how they come together, whether they are in union in one nature or in two natures. And I think that many theologians today would see that tragically the position of each side was exaggerated and misunderstood by the other side, whereas nowadays I think many people can see there is truth in each. It's just coming at the question from a different angle, if you like.
And also there's the greater realization that any set of doctrinal words is only an attempt at mystery.
Yes.
Mary.
That's precisely right.
Mary, thank you very much. It's been great having you here.
Thank you.